Welcome to this Vivado Quick Take tutorial focusing on managing IP versions. The agenda will start off by an overview of the IP versioning system used in Vivado and show you how you can distinguish between minor and major updates and show you how you can review the change logs and product guides to understand the changes that were made in the new IP versions. We'll then demonstrate the process used to upgrade to the current version of the IP or the Vivado software. This includes archiving design projects in their current version of software and backing up the IP to support those previous versions of software. We'll then report the status of the IP in a design project or manage IP location to help you make upgrade decisions. And then we'll show you how to upgrade the IP and review the upgrade log. We'll also demonstrate how to update the IP to target different devices. And you also have the ability to lock IP to a specific version of software. We'll demonstrate how to generate the output products to support that version of IP in future software releases. And we'll also discuss how to reconfigure older versions of IP. I'll now open the IP catalog in Vivado to review the IP version numbering scheme, as well as show you how you can access information about the various updates made to the IP. I'll now flatten the IP catalog so that I can see all the IP and their versions much easier. The major releases are distinguished by the major number increments. In other words, 1.0 to 2.0 to 3.0. Those are major IP updates, where the minor updates are the increments of 0.1. So here you see a 2.2 and a 0.1 and so forth. I can select any of the IP and invoke either the product guide, which we'll see in a minute, or the change log. The change log contains a running history of all the changes that have been made to the IP across all the software versions. Notice here that from version 2013.2 to 2013.3 there was a major upgrade, and it went from 9.1 to 10.0. And all of the major changes are listed here in the change log for more details. Looking back a little bit, if you notice between version 2013.1 to 2013.2 was a minor update and went from version 9.0 to 9.1. And looking back a little further, you'll see from version 2012.3 to 2012.4, the main version remained the same at 8.3, but there was a revision, a Rev.1, and it was just to support the IES Silicon for Arctic 7. So you'll see some of these revisions in some of the IPs that don't really have any functional changes in the IP, but they're IP changes to support different silicon or different features. If I want more information about the changes that have happened particular to the IP, I can get that in the product guide. I'll open one of the product guides here, and notice there's a new chapter called Migrating and Upgrading, which contain the details and process for migrating this IP into a newer version of software. There may be top-level interface or port name changes, property or configuration setup changes, and so forth. Each IP in the 2013.3 release has a migrating and upgrading chapter to help you understand and implement the process to upgrade the IP. Now, in order to demonstrate upgrading IP from one version of software to the next, I've prepared two 2013.2 projects to upgrade to 2013.3. One is a typical design project. It's actually our WaveGen design example project with some additional IP added. And the other is a manage IP location project, which only contains IP. Let's start off by reviewing the IP that's in the WaveGen example design. Now, some of this IP has been configured and is stored within the project directory, while two of them have been imported from a remote manage IP location. Notice I've got a couple of out-of-context runs that created design checkpoints for a couple of the IP. And finally, I've got one of the IP that was imported as a source as a design checkpoint. In 2013.2, designers had to make the choice whether they imported the IP.xci file as a source, or you could import a design checkpoint after synthesis, which is essentially a synthesized netlist for the IP that would be inserted into the design prior to implementation. Now, typically, you probably wouldn't have your project set up this way, but I wanted to demonstrate all the scenarios for the IP in 2013.2 and how they would migrate into 2013.3. The first thing we recommend that all designers do when migrating to a new release of software is to archive the design project in the current version of software. You can use the archive design command, and it will copy all of the remote sources into one zipped tarball project that can be expanded later and used with that same version of software. If you've configured your IP in a remote manage IP location, we recommend that you create a copy of it prior to upgrading it to the newest release of software. This way you can ensure you always have a copy of the IP that will work with that prior version of software. And if you're using any type of revision control system to manage your IP, we recommend checking in the entire directory structure and all the output products as is. Now let's go ahead and get started by updating the 2013.2 Manage IP project into 2013.3. To do that, I've invoked 2013.3 and I'll open that Manage IP location. Notice I'm presented with a dialog that asks me to uprev the project to the latest version of the project to support 2013.3. I'll go ahead and do that. Once complete, I'm presented with another dialog that's suggesting that I run the report IP status command to report the status of the IP in the project relative to the latest versions of the IP. Notice you can see now in the IP status window that I've got 3 of my IP that received major version changes in this release, 3 with minor version changes, 1 with just a revision change, and 1 that's up to date. And notice I can access the change log to review the changes made to this version of the IP. I'm going to go ahead to select all the IP for upgrade and upgrade them. Notice that once the upgrade is complete, I'm presented with the Generate Output Products dialog. Here I can select a number of processors so I can run multiple IP in parallel, and I can generate the output products for all the IP, including the synthesized design checkpoints, which are the default in 2013.3. I'll select the Generate button to generate all the output products, including the synthesized design checkpoints for each of the IP. And notice that once all the output products are generated, an out-of-context run is created to synthesize each of the IP. So now I've successfully upgraded all of my IP, regenerated output products, and as soon as synthesis completes on the IP runs, the IP will be ready to use in any 2013.3 design projects. Notice that when I rerun the IP status report, all the IP is now showing up to date and no updates are suggested. When upgraded, each IP receives an upgrade log detailing the effects of the upgrade. You can see the different types of information in the upgrade log with some of these different types of IP. And remember, I can always invoke the product guide to get more detailed information about the changes that were made to the IP, including any interface or port name changes at the top level, which would require top-level design changes in order to accommodate the new version of the IP. In 2013.3, we made quite a few changes to the IP to make them all consistent, to bring clocks and resets up at the top level so they can be more easily shared, and to ensure that the IP is more easily maintainable and upgradable in future releases. It's also a good idea to walk through the configuration wizards for the various IP to ensure that you're aware of any changes made or any new properties or configuration settings which may have been added. Now that the runs are complete, this project is ready. Now let's go ahead and open up that WaveGen example we had with the various types of IP in the 2013.3 release. I'll use the browser to open that project. And notice I'm presented with the dialog to upgrade the project revision to this revision of software. I'll go ahead and do that. And again, once done, you'll see that I'm presented with the Report IP Status dialog asking me if I want to report the IP status, which I'll do here. Notice now in this design project, I've got 4 IPs that received major updates, 2 with minor, and notice 2 are up to date. These are the 2 that were imported from the Manage IP location that we just upgraded. Since they've already been upgraded, they show up to date here in this design project. It's a good idea to do all of the operations such as update or recustomization of any remote Manage IP project in that Manage IP project. Even though you can do it from here, since this design references the IP, it's good to do it from the Manage IP project to consolidate all the runs, messages, and output products in one place. And notice now that if I look in my sources window, I notice that the IP is locked. In other words, I cannot recustomize or reconfigure this IP until I upgrade it to this release. I can continue to use it in its current form or its locked form indefinitely. Vivado only supports reconfiguring the current version of the IP. If you're referencing older versions of IP, you can still use them in your design and they'll process fine. You just can't recustomize them. If you want to recustomize the IP, you either need to upgrade it first into the current version of software or use the original version of software that the IP was created with to reconfigure it. Notice that when I try to recustomize one of the IP here in 2013.3, it tells me that the IP is locked and it will not enable reconfiguration. Now, for the sake of demonstration, I'm going to elect to upgrade all of my IP with the exception of one. I'll select all but the Giganet Ethernet IP here to update. Notice again, once the update is complete, I'm presented with the Generate Output Products dialog. And I can hit the Generate button, similar to what I just did with the Manage IP project, to generate the output products. Notice that all the IP are up to date, with the exception of the one we chose to ignore. And notice the out-of-context synthesis runs have started to synthesize those IP I've selected. And in case you've got any 2013.2 projects where you've used a design checkpoint as the source, as you recall, you had to make a choice in 2013.2 to either use the XCI or the DCP file as a source. In 2013.3 and beyond, those are combined into one entity. So in this case, I'm going to elect to remove the Cordic IP DCP file here and replace it with the actual DCP IP. And notice that once I've imported it, I now have access to the DCP that's internal to the IP, as well as the IP sources, and I can reconfigure the IP and so forth. So any projects in 2013.2 which you've added design checkpoints to and want to migrate them forward, you might want to consider replacing those checkpoints with the actual IP. And lastly, the IP that's been upgraded to the 2013.3 release is available for customization. I'm now going to demonstrate how to update IP to target a different part. The first example here, I'll show you how to update a Manage IP location to target all of the IP in the project to a different part. It might be a good idea to copy the IP location, as we showed you earlier, to preserve those IP for the original part. Once you've done that, open the Manage IP location and select the Project Settings button in the main toolbar. And notice here I can use the Project Device browser to select a new target device. In this case, I've selected a different package for the 485T. Once I do that, all of my IP sources in the Sources window now appear locked. I can use the Report IP Status command to report on the status of the IP. Notice it's indicating that there has been a part change to the project. If I update all the IP, it will retarget all the IP in the project to the new part. Notice I can selectively select IP to target the new part. Any IP that targets a part that's not the project device will remain locked for further customization. I do need to regenerate output products to retarget this IP. These retargeted IP are now available for recustomization and once synthesis completes, for use in designs. Now let's walk through a different example. In this example, we'll import a IP into a design project which is targeting a different device. And going back to the WaveGen example design, I use the Add Sources command to select an IP that targets a different part. Notice this one's targeting a 550. The IP is added to the project. As you notice, it also appears with a locked icon, indicating that it is not available for further customization. If I select it and look at the Properties view, you can see the warning indicating a part mismatch. Notice I can select the IP and use the Upgrade IP command directly from the Sources view. It updates the IP and again prompts me to regenerate the output products, which I'll do. The out-of-context run for the IP is started, and once complete, the IP is ready for use in the design. So in summary, Vivado IP provides a consistent upgrade strategy for all Vivado IP. It includes a versioning numbering scheme with minor and major upgrades. They include change logs and product guides to describe the upgrades to the IP and the upgrades required to the top-level design to integrate the IP. All Vivado IP is upgradable using the upgrade IP command. You've also got the ability to lock to a specific version of IP as you migrate to new software releases. Once you generate the output products required, that IP can be used in future releases. Vivado IP is designed to support easier IP configuration, validation, and management going forward with new releases. Thank you very much for your time.